The bitter harvest. Get this trash out of my sight, Elena, and take that mistake of yours with you before you stain the hardwood. The words didn't just cut, they cauterized. My brother Marcus stood at the head of the mahogany dining table, his face flushed with expensive Cabernet and unearned arrogance. With a grunt of effort, he shoved 3 heavy wooden crates across the floor. They screeched against the polish, slamming into my shins. Dirt and dried grape skins spilled onto my boots. The silence that followed was suffocating. My 5-year-old daughter Maya whimpered behind my coat, her small hands trembling as she gripped my waist. I felt the heat rising in my chest, a volatile mix of white-hot rage and the old familiar shame I had been fed since I was a teenager. "Marcus, that's enough," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Is it?" My sister Serena chimed in, swirling her glass. She was 25, wearing a silk dress that cost more than my monthly rent. "You show up here to Vance Estates looking like a charity case, expecting a seat at the table Dad built. You haven't contributed a single drop of sweat to this vineyard in a decade." "I was legally supposed to." "You were supposed to be a Vance," my mother Eleanor interrupted. She didn't even look at me. She was staring at Maya with a coldness that could freeze the very vines outside. "Instead, you brought a constant reminder of your lack of discipline into this house. She doesn't belong here, Elena. She isn't part of the legacy." "She is your granddaughter," I hissed, the anger finally breaking through. "She is a liability," Eleanor snapped. "Now take those crates. They contain the old clothes you left in the cellar. Consider them your severance package from this family. Don't come back." I looked around the room. The flickering candles, the smell of roasted turkey, the gold-rimmed plates, everything felt like a stage set for a play I was no longer cast in. My brother smirked, a victor in a war I hadn't realized we were fighting. I reached down and picked up Maya. I didn't cry. I had run out of tears for these people years ago. I looked Marcus dead in the eye, ignoring the bruising on my legs. "You're right, Marcus," I said, my voice chillingly calm. "I don't belong here. Not in this version of the story. But remember this moment. Remember the sound of those crates hitting the floor." "Is that a threat, Elle?" Marcus laughed, leaning back. "What are you going to do, blog about us?" "No," I whispered. "I'm going to do something much more permanent." I turned my back on them and walked out into the biting November wind. I didn't slam the door. A slammed door is a sign of weakness. A quiet exit is a promise. As I buckled Maya into her car seat in my rusting SUV, my hands were shaking, but not from the cold. I pulled out my phone. The screen glowed, showing the recording app I had triggered the moment I stepped onto the porch. "Take that mistake of yours with you." Marcus's voice played back tinny, but clear. I stared at the sprawling lights of the Vance vineyard in the rearview mirror, the $4 million estate that was built on my father's dreams and my siblings' greed. They thought they had just thrown out the trash. They had no idea they had just handed me the match to burn their kingdom down. "Mommy," Maya's voice was small. "Are we bad?" I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "No, baby, we aren't bad. We're just the new owners of their nightmare. The long game begins." The windshield wipers of my battered SUV groaned against the sleet as we drove away from the glowing warmth of Vance Estates. In the back seat, Maya had fallen asleep, her thumb tucked into her mouth, a habit she only reverted to when she was scared. Seeing her like that fueled a fire in my gut that no amount of Napa Valley rain could extinguish. For 3 years, I had worked 3 jobs. I was a freelance digital marketing consultant by day, a ghostwriter for lifestyle influencers by evening, and a strategic investor in the quiet hours of the night. My family thought I was a failure because I didn't wear pearls or post photos from yacht decks. They didn't realize I had spent those 3 years building a digital fortress under a pseudonym that they actually followed and admired. I pulled into the driveway of my modest two-bedroom cottage 30 miles away from the vineyard. It was small, but it was mine. I carried Maya inside, tucked her into bed, and went straight to my office. A corner of the living room, crowded with 3 monitors and a high-end microphone. I opened my laptop. The blue light hit my face, reflecting the cold determination in my eyes. I opened a file labeled Vance_Estates_Debt_Structure. My father had been a visionary, but Marcus was a gambler. Through my industry contacts, I had discovered months ago that Marcus had taken out a massive bridge loan to expand the winery's production. He had over-leveraged the estate to the tune of $12,500,000, betting everything on a limited reserve line that was currently failing to meet market expectations. He was drowning, and he was too arrogant to admit it. The phone rang. It was Sarah, my attorney, and the only person who knew the full extent of my plan. "Elena, I saw the news. Your mother officially announced Marcus as the sole CEO this evening at the gala." Sarah said, her voice laced with sympathy. "I know," I replied, leaning back and watching the recording of Marcus's insult loop on my screen. "Let them celebrate. How is the acquisition of the holding company going?" "The shell company we set up, Phoenix Vineyards Group, is ready," Sarah confirmed. "We've successfully bought up 40% of their outstanding debt from the secondary lenders. Marcus thinks he's still dealing with a faceless bank in Chicago. He has no idea the bank sold his soul to you for 80 cents on the dollar." "Good. I want the rest. I want the mortgage on the main house, Sarah. Every single cent of that $12,500,000 debt needs to be under my control by the end of the quarter." "It's risky, Elle. You're putting every penny of your savings into this. If the vineyard fails completely, you lose everything." I looked at the photo on my desk, a picture of me, Dad, and Marcus when we were children. Dad's arm was around me, telling me I had the nose for the business. Marcus was in the background, already scowling. "It won't fail," I said firmly, "because I'm the one who's going to fix it after I take it away from them." The next morning, I began the second phase of my plan, public perception. Under my online persona, the Napa Insider, a blog with over 500,000 dedicated followers in the wine and luxury industry, I posted a cryptic review. "A once great legacy is souring. I recently tasted the newest Vance Reserve. It tastes of desperation and poor management. Investors beware. The vines aren't the only thing rotting at Vance Estates." By noon, the post had 50,000 shares. By 2 p.m., the Vance Estates stock, what little was traded privately, took a 15% dive. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Serena, my sister. "Serena, did you see what that insider person posted? Marcus is throwing a fit. He thinks someone leaked the production issues. If I find out you've been talking to your little blogger friends about us, I'll make sure you never work in this valley again." I smiled, a slow, predatory curve of my lips. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened a new document and began drafting the script for Chapter 1 of my re-entry plan. I wasn't just going to take their money, I was going to take their reputation. I wanted Eleanor to feel the sting of social exile. I wanted Serena to realize her silk dresses were bought with my stolen inheritance. And Marcus, I wanted him to stand in the mud just like I had while I showed him what a mistake looked like when it grew teeth. "Mommy, why are you smiling at the computer?" Maya asked, rubbing her eyes as she stood in the doorway. I closed the laptop and walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. "Because, Maya, we're playing a very big game of hide and seek." "Are we hiding?" she asked. "No," I whispered, kissing her forehead. "We're the ones who are about to find everyone." The turning of the tide. The following 3 weeks were a whirlwind of calculated silence. While Marcus scrambled to find the mole in his organization, and Eleanor hosted increasingly desperate tea parties to repair their social standing, I moved through the shadows of the industry. I was no longer just Elena Vance, the cast-off daughter. I was the silent ghost haunting their balance sheets. "Elena, the final signatures are in," Sarah called me on a Tuesday morning. Her voice sounded breathless. The holding company now owns 92% of the Vance estate's debt. We just purchased the primary mortgage on the main manor and the processing facility for $8.7 million. Marcus missed his last interest payment. He's officially in default. A cold shiver of triumph raced down my spine. How long until we can trigger the foreclosure? Technically now, but if you want to walk in there and take the keys, we need to file the notice of receivership. The court will appoint a manager, which per the contract we drafted, will be your designated representative. Which is me, I said, looking at my reflection in the window. I looked different. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a sharpened edge. I want the notice served on Friday, during their annual First Press Gala. Elena, that's brutal, Sarah whispered, though I could hear the smirk in her voice. They'll be in front of every major distributor in California. They wanted a show, I replied. I'm just giving them a finale. To prepare, I spent $4,000 on a single dress. It was emerald green, the color of envy, and healthy vines tailored so perfectly it felt like armor. I hired a high-end stylist to transform my look from struggling single mom to corporate raider. The night of the gala arrived. The Vance estates were draped in fairy lights, the scent of expensive oak and fermented grapes heavy in the air. As I pulled my new black Range Rover, rented for the occasion, up to the valet, I felt Maya's hand squeeze mine. She was staying with Sarah for the night, but I kept a photo of her in my clutch. This was for her. I stepped out of the car. The valet blinked, not recognizing me at first. I walked past the security guards with a look of such absolute authority that they didn't even ask for an invitation. Inside the ballroom was packed. I saw Serena near the bar laughing with a group of socialites, her diamonds glittering under the chandeliers. Eleanor was holding court near the fireplace, looking every bit the ice queen. And there was Marcus, standing on the small stage, a glass of wine in his hand, preparing to give his speech. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus boomed, his voice amplified by the speakers. This year has had its challenges, but the Vance legacy is stronger than ever. We are proud to announce a new partnership that will... Actually, Marcus, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a piano wire snapping. The only thing you're announcing tonight is your resignation. The room went dead silent. Hundreds of heads turned toward the back of the hall. Marcus squinted his face, turning a mottled purple as he recognized me. Elena, he stammered, then regained his sneer. Security! I told you she was barred. Get this woman out of here. 2 security guards moved toward me, but I didn't flinch. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope bound in legal blue tape. I didn't hand it to the guards. I walked straight up the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically on the marble. Don't touch me, I told the guards without looking at them. They hesitated, sensing the shift in the room's energy. I climbed the steps of the stage. Marcus backed away a step, his bravado crumbling. What is this, another pathetic plea for money? Eleanor shouted from the front row, her face contorted in rage. You are embarrassing yourself, Elena. No, Mother, I said, leaning into the microphone so every distributor and journalist in the room could hear me. I'm conducting business. Marcus, you defaulted on your $12,500,000 loan with Midwest Credit 3 days ago. That debt was sold to Phoenix Vineyards Group. I tossed the legal envelope onto the podium. I am the CEO of Phoenix Vineyards. As of 5:00 p.m. today, I have initiated a full foreclosure on Vance Estates, including this house, the winery, and the land you're standing on. You aren't the host of this party anymore, Marcus. You're a trespasser. The silence was so heavy, it felt physical. Marcus ripped open the envelope, his hands shaking. His eyes scanned the documents, his face draining of all color. This is a mistake, he whispered. This can't be legal. It's very legal, I said, stepping closer so only he could hear me. And remember those crates of trash you threw at me? I tracked the dirt from your boots all the way to the bank. You're done. Serena ran toward the stage, her voice high and shrill. You can't do this. Where will we go? This is our home. You have 24 hours to pack your things, I said, turning to address the entire room. As for the rest of you, the wine is still flowing, but the management has changed. Please enjoy the evening. It's the last time a Vance of his caliber will ever serve you. I walked off the stage, leaving my family frozen in the spotlight of their own ruin. As I reached the exit, I felt a hand grab my arm. It was Eleanor. You spiteful, selfish girl, she hissed, her eyes wet with fury. You would destroy your own father's name just for revenge. I leaned in, my voice cold as a tomb. Dad's name was already dying in Marcus's hands. I didn't destroy it, Eleanor. I bought it, and tomorrow I'm changing the locks. The eviction of ego. The morning after the gala felt different. The air in Napa usually smelled of damp earth and promise, but today as I pulled up the long, winding driveway of the estate, it smelled like victory. I wasn't alone. Behind my SUV were 2 white vans labeled Security and Locksmith Services and a professional moving crew I had hired. I didn't want this to be a messy brawl. I wanted it to be a clinical extraction. As I stepped onto the porch, the massive oak doors swung open. Marcus stood there, his tuxedo from the night before rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like a man who had spent the night trying to find a loophole that didn't exist. You aren't coming in? He croaked, blocking the doorway. Marcus, move, I said, not slowing my pace. I have a court-ordered writ of possession. If you stay in my way, the sheriff's deputies parked at the gate will be up here in 60 seconds to escort you out in handcuffs. He looked past me at the locksmiths and the moving vans. The reality finally hit him. He stepped back, stumbling slightly. Inside the house was a disaster. Eleanor was in the formal living room, frantically shoving silver spoons and small crystal vases into a designer suitcase. Serena was on the phone screaming at someone, likely a lawyer, who was telling her the same thing Sarah had told me: Elena holds all the cards. Put the silver down, Eleanor, I said, walking into the room. My mother froze. She turned, clutching a George III teapot to her chest. This is family heirloom. You have no right. Actually, the debt agreement included all interior assets and fixtures as collateral for the business loans Marcus signed, I replied, checking a clipboard. Everything in this house belongs to the holding company now, including that teapot. Put it back on the sideboard or I'll add theft of corporate assets to the list of reasons you're leaving. You monster! Serena spat, slamming her phone down. We have nowhere to go. All our accounts are tied to the estate. Marcus said. Marcus lied, I interrupted, looking at my brother, who had slumped into a chair. He used your personal guarantees to back his failed expansion. He didn't just lose the vineyard, Serena. He lost your trust funds, too. The look on Serena's face shifted from rage to pure, unadulterated terror. She turned to Marcus. Is that true, Marcus? Tell me she's lying? Marcus couldn't even look at her. He just stared at the floor. I turned to the moving crew. Pack up their clothes and personal toiletries. Nothing else. They have 1 hour to vacate the premises. For the next 60 minutes, I watched the people who had treated me like a mistake crumble. I stood in the center of the foyer, a silent sentinel, as my mother wailed about her reputation, and Serena scrambled to pack a single suitcase of shoes. Marcus finally stood up. He walked over to me, his face inches from mine. You think you're so smart, Elle. You think you can run this place? The distributors hate you now. The staff won't work for a traitor. The staff haven't been paid in 2 months, Marcus, I countered. I just sent a wire transfer to the estate's payroll account. Every field hand and cellar worker just got a 10% bonus and a letter of apology from the new owner. They don't hate me. They're waiting for my instructions. He went pale. He hadn't even realized he'd stopped paying the people who actually made the wine. "One more thing," I said as the movers began carrying their suitcases to the porch. "I found the crates you threw at me on Thanksgiving. The ones with my trash." I pointed to the driveway. The movers had dumped those same 3 wooden crates filled with dirt and old rags right next to Marcus's luxury sedan. "I'm returning them to you." I smiled. "Consider it your severance. Now get off my property." Eleanor walked out last, her head held high despite the tears streaming down her face. She stopped at the door and looked at me with a cold, piercing glare. "You'll be lonely in this big house, Elena. Just you and that child. Nobody will ever truly love a woman who betrays her own blood." "I'd rather be lonely in a house I own than family in a house built on lies, Eleanor," I replied. "And don't worry about Maya. She's going to grow up knowing exactly what it means to be a Vance, the real kind." I shut the door and locked it. The sound of the deadbolt clicking home was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. I leaned my back against the door and closed my eyes, taking a long, deep breath. The silence was magnificent. But as I looked around the empty, cavernous foyer, I knew the battle wasn't over. Foreclosing was the easy part. Now I had to save the vines. I had to prove that the mistake was the only one capable of making the vintage of a lifetime. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Hey, it's Elena," I said when the person picked up. "I need the best vineyard manager in the country, and I need you in Napa by Monday. We have a lot of work to do." The weight of the crown. The first week of ownership was not the victory lap I had imagined. It was a descent into a financial and agricultural purgatory. I spent 18 hours a day in the estate office, surrounded by stacks of neglected invoices and souring reports. Marcus hadn't just been arrogant, he had been negligent. The irrigation systems in the North Block were failing, and the 2024 Cabernet barrels were showing signs of oxidation because he'd cut costs on temperature control. On Thursday morning, a heavy knock echoed through the office door. Before I could answer, a man in salt and pepper hair and mud-caked boots walked in. It was Julian Varga, the man I'd called at the end of Chapter 4. He was the legendary vineyard whisperer who had helped my father build this place 20 years ago. "The vines look like hell, Elena," Julian said, tossing a handful of shriveled grapes onto my mahogany desk. "Your brother tried to force a second harvest out of the late-season crops. He pushed them too hard. They're stressed." I rubbed my temples, the weight of the $12,500,000 debt pressing down on my shoulders. "Can we save them, Julian?" "We can save the roots," he said, pulling up a chair. "But we have to sacrifice this year's mid-tier profit. We need to prune back 30% of the active growth to let the soil recover. If we don't, the whole estate will be barren in 2 years. If I cut 30% of production, I can't meet the interest payments to the secondary creditors," I whispered. "I'll lose the very thing I just fought to win." "Then you have to choose," Julian replied, his eyes piercing. "Do you want to be a banker, or do you want to be a winemaker? Your father was a winemaker. Marcus was a banker." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the rolling hills of the Napa Valley. In the distance, I saw a small figure running through the garden. It was Maya playing with a kite I'd bought her. She looked happy, safe. I realized then that if I followed Marcus's path, prioritizing the numbers over the land, I would eventually become exactly like the family I had evicted. I wouldn't just be holding the crown. I'd be poisoned by it. "Prune them," I said, my voice firm. "We save the land." I'll find the money somewhere else. As Julian left to give the orders, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Elena, it's Serena. My sister's voice sounded hollow, stripped of its usual venom. We're at a motel in Calistoga. Mom won't stop crying and Marcus, he's gone L. He took the last $50,000 from the emergency cash account and disappeared. He left us with nothing. A cold lump formed in my throat. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell her it served them right. But then I looked back at Maya in the garden. Why are you calling me Serena? I asked, my voice as cold as the cellar floor. We don't have enough to pay for another night, she sobbed. Mom's jewelry is all she has left, and she's talking like she doesn't want to be here anymore. Please. I know we were horrible. I know what we did to you and the girl. But we're family. Family! I spat the word out like it was vinegar. Family is the woman you kicked out into a storm with a 4-year-old child. Family is the sister you called a charity case in front of the whole valley. I know, I'm sorry, she wailed. Please, Elena, just help us get on our feet. I'll do anything. I looked at the invoices on my desk. I looked at the shriveled grapes Julian had left. The anger was there. It was a roaring beast, but beneath it was a sudden sharp clarity. I won't give you a cent of the company's money, I said. But I have a proposal. I've just ordered a 30% reduction in vineyard maintenance staff to save costs. If you want a place to stay, there are 3 worker cottages at the far edge of the property. They're drafty small, and they smell like sulfur. There was a long silence on the other end. You want us to live in the labor shacks? Serena whispered. No, I corrected. I want you to work in the labor shacks. If you and Eleanor want to eat, you'll report to Julian at 5 a.m. tomorrow. You'll be in the fields pruning the vines you helped destroy. You'll earn minimum wage, and half of it will go toward paying back the silver you tried to steal. Mom will never do it, Serena said, her voice trembling. Then Mom can sleep in the car, I replied. You have 1 hour to decide. Don't call me back unless you're wearing work boots. I hung up. My heart was hammering against my ribs. It wasn't the big-hearted forgiveness people wrote about in books. It was something harsher. It was justice. I wasn't just taking their home. I was going to make them build mine brick by brick, vine by vine. I turned back to my computer and began typing. I had a blog post to write for the Napa Insider. Topic: the resurrection of Vance Estates. Why a mistake is the best thing that ever happened to this soil. The pruning of pride. The sun hadn't even thought about rising when the headlights of a rusted sedan flickered at the edge of the property. I watched from my bedroom window, sipping black coffee, as Serena and Eleanor stepped out into the freezing 4:00 a.m. mist. They looked pathetic. Eleanor was wearing a Chanel trench coat over thick leggings, and Serena looked like she hadn't slept in 48 hours. Julian was already waiting for them by the equipment shed, a pair of heavy-duty pruning shears in his hand. I didn't go down to greet them. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of a conversation. I wanted them to feel the weight of the land. By noon, I was in the tasting room meeting with a group of skeptical distributors from San Francisco. They had heard the rumors of the foreclosure and were ready to pull their contracts. Elena, look, said Mr. Sterling, a man who had bought Vance wine for 30 years. Your brother was a nightmare, but at least he had a harvest. You've just cut 30% of your inventory. How do you expect us to stay loyal to a brand that's bleeding out? I stood at the head of the table, the emerald dress from the gala replaced by a sharp charcoal gray blazer. I had a bottle of the 2020 Reserve on the table, the last good year my father had produced. "Mr. Sterling, you aren't buying inventory," I said, pouring him a glass. "You're buying a comeback. My brother was selling you juice flavored with chemicals and debt. I'm selling you the soul of this valley. Yes, I cut the crop, because I'm not interested in making mediocre wine for people who don't care. I'm making a limited high-end vintage that will be the talk of the 2026 season." "And what makes you think you can pull that off?" he asked, sniffing the glass. "Because I have nothing left to lose," I replied. "And because I'm the only one in this family who actually knows how to work." As if on cue, a commotion broke out outside. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the tasting room, we saw Eleanor. She had tripped in the mud of the north block. Her expensive coat was ruined, and she was sitting in the dirt staring at a pile of discarded branches. The distributors watched, stunned. Is that Eleanor Vance?" Sterling gasped. "She's my new apprentice," I said, not missing a beat. "I believe in starting from the ground up. If the former owner's wife can learn the value of a grape, imagine what the wine will taste like." Sterling looked at the muddy woman in the field, then back at me. A slow, respectful smile spread across his face. "You're cold, Elena. I like that in a CEO. Give me the exclusivity for the 2026 Reserve. I'll double my deposit." After the meeting, I walked out to the fields. Julian was standing over Serena, who was crying as she tried to clip a stubborn vine. "It's too hard," she sobbed. "My hands are bleeding." "Wear the gloves I gave you," Julian said, his voice like gravel. "And keep moving. You're behind schedule." I approached them, my shadow falling over Serena. She looked up at me, her face smeared with dirt and mascara. "Are you enjoying the Vance legacy now, Serena?" I asked. "You're a monster," she whispered. "Mom can barely breathe. How can you be so cruel?" "Cruel." I leaned down, my voice a sharp whisper. "Cruel was letting my daughter sleep in a car because you wouldn't let us into the house on a rainy Tuesday 2 years ago. Cruel was laughing while Marcus threw my clothes into the mud. This isn't cruelty. This is a job. One you're lucky to have." Eleanor looked up from where she was sitting. The fire in her eyes had been replaced by a hollow, haunting emptiness. "You've won, Elena. You have the house, the money, and you have us in the dirt. Are you happy now?" I looked at her, the woman who had chosen her son's ego over her daughter's survival. "I'm not looking for happiness, Eleanor," I said, turning to walk away. "I'm looking for a return on my investment. Get back to work. You've only cleared 3 rows, and you're costing me money." As I walked back to the main house, I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't the rush of joy I expected. It was a heavy, cold satisfaction. I was winning, but the cost was becoming clear. To save the vineyard, I had to be the villain in their story. I reached the porch and found Maya sitting there drawing with chalk on the stone steps. She had drawn a giant purple grape. "Look, Mommy, I'm helping," she chirped. I picked her up and held her tight. "Yes, you are, baby. You're the only reason the sun comes up." My phone buzzed in my pocket. A private investigator I had hired to find Marcus was calling. "We found him, Elena," the voice said. "He's in Vegas, and he's not alone. He's meeting with a representative from Vanguard Spirits, your biggest competitor. It looks like he's trying to sell them the proprietary blending secrets your father left in his private journals." My blood turned to ice. The journals. Marcus had stolen the only thing I hadn't been able to find in the office safe. "Thank you," I said, my voice trembling with a new kind of rage. "Keep watching him. If he tries to sell those journals, I want to be the one who stops the transaction." The war wasn't over. Marcus was still trying to burn the house down from the outside. The Vegas Gambit. The news of Marcus's final betrayal didn't just break my heart. It set my soul on fire. In the Vance family, loyalty was a currency that had long since been devalued. But this was different. The journals, my father's leather-bound, handwritten legacy, weren't just business assets. They contained 40 years of ghost notes, the precise timing of fermentation, the secret soil amendments for the North Block, and the proprietary blending ratios that gave our Cabernet its legendary velvet finish. If Vanguard Spirits, our most predatory competitor, got their hands on those pages, they wouldn't just replicate our wine. They would mass-produce a cheap imitation, flooding the market and turning the Vance name into a punchline. I have to go to Vegas, I told Sarah over the phone, my fingers trembling as I threw a black blazer and my father's old pocket watch into a small leather bag. Elena, listen to me, Sarah warned, her voice tight with professional concern. You are in the middle of a high-stakes restructuring. If the bank or your creditors see you jetting off to a casino town, they'll think you're as reckless as Marcus. I'm not going there to throw dice, Sarah, I snapped, zipping the bag shut. I'm going there to collect a debt that was stolen from my daughter's future. Keep an eye on the vineyard, and keep Maya safe. I caught the red-eye flight. Las Vegas was a neon fever dream, the polar opposite of the disciplined, quiet rows of the Napa Valley. I tracked my private investigator to the Bellagio, where the air was thick with the chime of slot machines. I saw him in a corner booth of the high-limit lounge. Marcus looked like a king in a kingdom of sand. He was wearing a gold Rolex bought no doubt with the $50,000 he'd emptied from the workers' emergency fund. Across from him sat Julian Henderson, the vice president of Vanguard Spirits. And there, sitting on the marble table between them like a trophy, was the journal. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out a chair and sat down directly next to Marcus. Is this seat taken? I asked, my voice as cold as a cellar floor in winter. Marcus jumped, nearly knocking over his glass of scotch. Elena, how did you find me? I'm the CEO of Vance Estates, I said, looking Henderson dead in the eye. And I'm here to inform you that the item on this table is stolen property. If you so much as touch that book, Mr. Henderson, Vanguard will be hit with a racketeering lawsuit before the sun rises. Marcus's face turned an ugly purple. You already took the house. This journal belongs to the eldest son. You aren't a winemaker, Marcus. You're a thief, I hissed. I turned back to Henderson. Is a few blending secrets worth a PR nightmare in the middle of your IPO walkaway? Or I'll make sure the world knows Vanguard builds its brands on stolen scraps. Henderson was a shark, but sharks don't swim in toxic water. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. It was a pleasure meeting you, Ms. Vance. Marcus, don't call my office again. As Henderson walked away, Marcus lunged for the journal, but I was faster. I grabbed the book and stood up. The police are at the front desk, Marcus. I didn't just come for the book. I came to make sure you never walk into a boardroom again. I walked out, clutching my father's soul to my chest. But as I reached the exit, my phone buzzed with a frantic alert from Julian. Elena, get back here. The South Block is on fire. Your mother and Serena? They're trapped in the cellar. The purgatory of fire. The flight back to California was a blurred nightmare of static and prayer. I landed in Santa Rosa at 3 a.m., the air already thick with the scent of charred wood and scorched earth carried by the treacherous Diablo winds. As I sped toward the vineyard, the horizon was a bruised, pulsating orange. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a frantic question. Are they alive? Is it all gone? When I reached the gates of Vance Estates, the scene was apocalyptic. 3 fire engines were parked on the lawn, their red lights strobing against the thick gray curtains of smoke. The South Block, the section Julian and I had worked so hard to prune, was a skeleton of glowing embers. Elena, over here! I saw Julian near the main processing facility. His face was smeared with soot, his eyebrows singed. He was holding a wet towel to his neck. Where are they? I screamed over the roar of the pumper trucks. Where's my mother? Where's Serena? Julian pointed toward the historic stone cellar. The fire started in the brush behind their cottage. Instead of running for the road, they ran to the cellar. They were trying to move the 2020 reserve barrels into the deep vault. They got trapped when the ventilation beams collapsed. Are they out? The firefighters just pulled Serena out. She's in the ambulance, but Eleanor, she went back in for the second rack. She wouldn't leave it, Elena. She kept screaming that it was all she had left. I didn't think. I didn't weigh the cost or remember the insults she'd hurled at me. I ran toward the stone building. Elena, no! The structure is unstable! Julian yelled, but I was already past the yellow tape. The heat near the cellar entrance was a physical wall thick enough to choke the lungs. I pulled my blazer over my mouth and dove into the darkened archway. Inside, the air was a toxic soup of smoke and the sickly sweet smell of evaporating wine. Thousands of dollars of my father's legacy were leaking onto the floor, mixing with the water from the sprinklers to create a purple slush. Mother, I coughed. Eleanor. A faint groan came from the back of the vault. I found her pinned under a heavy oak beam. She was cradling a single bottle, the very first vintage my father had ever bottled like it was a child. Her coat was charred, her silver hair matted with ash. Elena, she whispered. I saved it. I didn't let it burn. Forget the wine, Eleanor. We have to go. I shoved my shoulder against the beam. It was dead weight soaked in water and heat. I screamed with the effort, my muscles protesting. You will not die here, I thought. You don't get to leave me with this guilt. With a final heave, the beam shifted. I grabbed her under the arms and dragged her toward the light. Every step felt like walking through a furnace. The ceiling groaned, a shower of sparks raining down on us. We burst through the exit just as a section of the roof caved in. I collapsed onto the wet grass, gasping for air. The paramedics rushed over, sliding Eleanor onto a gurney. She was unconscious, but her fingers were still locked around that bottle. I saw Serena sitting on the back of an ambulance. Her hands were bandaged, her skin red. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears of profound, shattering shame. I'm sorry, she mouthed. We wanted to help. We didn't want you to lose everything. I sat in the dirt, my dress a rag of soot, and I started to laugh. It was a hollow, haunting sound. I had spent months trying to destroy them, only for them to nearly die trying to save the very thing I had taken. We lost the vines, Elena, Julian said quietly. 4 acres, and the cellar is a ruin. I clutched the journal I had brought back from Vegas, the book I had never let go of. We lost the wood and the grapes, Julian, but the soil is still here, and I have the secrets. The Ashen Resurrection. The days following the fire were draped in a heavy charcoal silence. The south block was a graveyard of blackened stakes and shriveled vines, but the air in the main house had shifted. The cold, sterile hostility that had defined the Vance family for decades had been burned away, replaced by a raw, uncomfortable honesty. Eleanor was home from the hospital, though she moved with a fragility I had never seen before. She sat in the sunroom, her bandaged hands resting on her lap, staring out at the scorched earth. Serena was different too. The vanity was gone. She spent her days helping Julian inventory the salvageable barrels, her designer clothes replaced by oversized flannel shirts and work jeans. I stood in the center of the ruined cellar, the smell of smoke still clinging to the stones. I opened my father's journal to the final page. There, in his shaky, elegant script, he had written, "The best wine doesn't come from the easiest years. It comes from the vines that had to fight the hardest to survive." I realized then that the fire hadn't just been a disaster. It was a cleansing. Elena! I turned to see my mother standing at the entrance of the cellar. She looked small against the charred beams. "I found this in the safe," she said, holding out a faded envelope. "Your father wrote it the night you left 10 years ago." Marcus told me it was just a legal document, a formal disinheritance. I believed him. I wanted to believe him because it was easier than admitting I had failed you. I took the envelope, my heart pounding. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a letter. "To my bravest daughter," it began. "The vineyard is a living thing. It knows who loves it and who merely uses it. Marcus has the ambition, but you have the soul. I am leaving you the controlling interest in the land, held in a trust that only triggers if the estate falls into debt. I knew they would push you out, Elena, but I also knew you were the only one strong enough to come back and save us from ourselves." I leaned against the cold stone wall, the tears finally coming. He had known. All those years I spent feeling like an outcast, a mistake. He had been betting on me. He hadn't just left me a business. He had left me a destiny. "I didn't know, Elena," Eleanor whispered, stepping into the damp light. "I let Marcus run this family because I was afraid of the truth. I was afraid of being alone. Can you ever forgive me?" I looked at her, this woman who had watched me walk out into the rain with a child. The anger was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but the hatred had evaporated in the heat of the fire. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Mother," I said, wiping my eyes. "But I'm not going to throw you out. We have 4 acres of dead vines to replant. We have a reputation to rebuild. And I need someone who knows the history of this soil to help me." Serena appeared behind Eleanor, her face smudged with soot. "We'll work, Elle. Whatever you need. We'll be the laborers this time." I looked at my sister, then at my mother. For the first time, I didn't see enemies or masters. I saw a broken family trying to find its way back to the roots. "Good," I said, closing the journal. "Because we're not making the old Vance wine anymore. We're making something new, something forged in the fire." I walked out of the cellar and into the bright, uncompromising sunlight. Maya was running through the rows of the north block, her laughter echoing off the hills. She was the future, and for the first time the path toward it was clear of thorns, the vintage of justice. 1 year later, the scars on the land had begun to fade, replaced by the vibrant, stubborn green of new growth. The air at Vance Estates no longer carried the acrid scent of smoke. Instead, it was filled with the sweet, intoxicating aroma of crushed grapes and damp earth. It was harvest season, the first true harvest under my sole command. I stood on the terrace of the main house, watching the sunrise bleed over the hills. Below me, the vineyard was a hive of activity. But the people moving between the rows weren't just hired hands. I saw Serena, her skin tanned, and her hands calloused, leading a team of pickers with a precision she had once reserved for social climbing. I saw Eleanor in the crushing room meticulously checking the brix levels of the fruit her once manicured fingers stained a deep regal purple. They weren't guests anymore. They were the backbone of the resurrection. "Mommy, look, I found a giant one." Maya came running toward me, holding a cluster of Cabernet grapes like a prize trophy. She was 6 now, her face a perfect mirror of the joy I had nearly lost. "It's beautiful, baby," I said, lifting her up. "That's the soul of the 2026 reserve right there." The 2026 reserve we had named it the Phoenix. The pre-orders had already broken every record in the estate's history. The story of the mistake who saved the legacy from the fire had become a legend in the valley. But I didn't care about the fame. I cared about the justice. My phone buzzed on the stone railing. It was a news alert from the city. Marcus Vance sentenced to 8 years for embezzlement and corporate fraud. I stared at the headline for a long time. There was no surge of joy, no laughter, just a quiet, heavy sense of closure. He had been offered the world and tried to sell it for a pittance. Now his world was 4 gray walls. I turned the screen off and tucked it away. He was a ghost now, and I had no more room for hauntings. A black sedan pulled up the driveway. Mr. Sterling, the distributor who had almost walked away during the darkest hour, stepped out. He walked up to the terrace, sniffing the air with a wide, genuine smile. "It smells like a masterpiece, Elena," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "I've been in this business 40 years, and I've never seen a turnaround like this." "How did you do it?" I looked out over the vines, then at my mother and sister working in the fields below. I felt the weight of my father's journal in my pocket, the book that had guided every pruning cut and every fermentation tank. "I didn't do it alone," I said, a truth I never thought I'd admit. "I realized that you can't grow a great vintage in a vacuum. You need the heat, the rain, and even the fire to make the roots go deep enough to find the truth." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Mayacamas Mountains, I gathered everyone in the formal dining room, the same room where Marcus had shoved those crates of trash at me. But the atmosphere was different. There were no insults, no silk dresses, no pretense, just a family exhausted and stained with the dirt of honest work. I poured 3 glasses of the first press, one for me, one for Serena, and one for Eleanor. "To the mistake," I said, raising my glass. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes misty with a mix of pride and regret. She raised her glass, her hand steady. "To the Savior," she corrected softly. We drank. The wine was bold, complex, and slightly smoky, a perfect reflection of everything we had survived. As the warmth of the vintage spread through my chest, I knew I had finally achieved what my father wanted. I hadn't just saved the business. I had reclaimed the name. The trash had been cleared away. All that remained was the gold. Look, people might try to write you off or call you a mistake, but don't let their words define you. The best revenge isn't getting even, it's outgrowing the people who tried to keep you down. Keep your head up, work hard, and let your success do the talking. You're not a mistake. You're the one who's going to build something they could never imagine. Just keep going. Thanks so much for sticking around and listening to Elena's story. It means a lot to have you here. If you enjoyed this journey, please hit that like button and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Elena's comeback. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. See you in the next one.